And welcome you all to the Indiana Landmark Center, and welcome to our virtual viewers. We're trying to keep this in sync, and I think we did it right on the spot. So we wanted to conclude this program at 3:50, and I think we did it. So as our speakers make the stage, I'll do some introductions. I think you've gotten to know Sam Collins a little bit, but here's some more information about Sam. He was born in Galveston, grew up in nearby Hitchcock. After graduating from Texas A&M University, he moved to Corpus Christi and then returned to Houston in 1996 and embarked on his career as an investment counselor with Edward Jones. In 2005, Sam and his wife purchased and began the restoration of a wonderful historic property, the Stringfellow Orchards in Hitchcock, Texas, which I was privileged to visit some years ago. And Sam tells me that restoration continues, and I said, "You'll never get done. You never. It's a major restoration effort, and it's a fabulous property." Since then, Sam has formed his own financial services company, SLC Investment Services, and more to the point of today's program, he has emerged as a prominent Juneteenth historian and ambassador in Galveston and around the nation. He is passionate about history and has served on the board of the Galveston Historical Foundation, the Old Central Cultural Center, and the Texas Historical Commission, among many other organizations. Sam's also active in historic preservation at the national level, as you heard, as an advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation for several years, where his voice is so important. So Sam, we're honored to have you here in Indiana. Faye Williams. Where do you start with Faye? Let me try. Like Sam, she's a native of Galveston and still wisely spends her winter months there. Also like Sam, Faye has advanced the meaning of Juneteenth, adding clarity and scholarship to the discussion of the holiday's significance. Faye graduated from Texas Southern University before heading north to study law at Indiana University. I asked Faye a little bit ago, I said, "I think people might be interested to know what brought you to Indiana?" She said she was following a man. Say no more. Her work in Indianapolis as a civil rights leader is legendary. She served in this community as a volunteer leader for many organizations. Here are just a few: the Central Indiana Regional Blood Center, the United Way, National Civic League, the Economic Development Corporation, and so many others. She was a founding member of the Indianapolis Urban League and president of the Indianapolis chapter of 100 Black Women. Among her awards are B'nai B'rith Woman of the Year, the Distinguished Citizen Award from the Municipal League, and an honorary Doctor of Laws from Martin University. I could go on and on, but we've got a program to get to. Olin Dotson. Indiana Landmarks is honored to have Dr. Dotson on our board of directors and as chair of our African American Landmarks Committee. Olin was born in Indianapolis, but spent much of his formative youth in Tulsa, where his family ties run deep, and the legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre had an impact on his forebears. Olin received a Bachelor of Arts in Architectural Science from the Tuskegee Institute. More degrees followed Ball State University and later from Columbia University, where he has a Master of Science in Real Estate Development. If that were not enough, Olin's commitment to addressing severely distressed inner city communities led him to receive a PhD in American Studies from Purdue University. And somewhere in the midst of that, Olin found time to start his own architecture company called Harmonics, which focused on inner city revitalization, receiving national and international recognition. He is a beloved professor at Ball State University's College of Architecture and Planning, where he currently serves as chair of the Department of Architecture. As our community confronts issues of health and vitality, and as we seek ways to heal the erasure of culture and neighborhood that has profoundly affected us, Olin's voice is a thoughtful and powerful one. Olin Dotson. So with that, I turn the program over to our distinguished panel. Thank you all for being here today.
Okay. Thanks for stitching that together.
Okay.
So we just saw a 45-minute documentary on the history of Juneteenth, how it started, what it means. But I would like to ask you both, from your personal experience and your life experience, what is Juneteenth? What is it to you? What is it to Galveston, to Texas, to the United States, and even to Indiana? Maybe we can just kind of start our conversation at that level.
Well, of course, I'm a BOI. That means born on the island. And as a child growing up, Juneteenth to my father's family, who lived in a small town about 40 miles away from the island, Brazoria, Juneteenth was a very special, we called it a high holy day, because my grandfather, my father's father, who was a cattleman, who was known for being, we just called being very stingy, except on Juneteenth. On Juneteenth, he would feed everybody. He would give away prizes, but no other day meant anything to him. He was the first generation out of slavery. He was born in 1872, and his family still lived on the place where they had been owned. It was called Bailey's Prayer in Brazoria, Texas. My Juneteenth journey started when I was 4 years old in 1938. It was the first time I went away from home without my mother. I went to the home place with my father, and there were two people who were being honored who had been slaves, Miss Martha and Uncle Pluce, the man was called. But I met my first role model there. There was a young lady who was about 11 years old, and she performed, I call it, rather than recited, General Order 3. I think all of you have have a copy of it. But that performance by that 10 or 11-year-old stayed with me until this day. She did it in the cadence of the Black preacher. As I said, it was a performance, not a recitation. And I made a pledge that day that I was going to be on that stage at a later date, talking about freedom and emancipation and informing the slaves that they are free. And to this day, that performance still rings in my head. I was disappointed, however, because I was not allowed to do General Order 3. At a couple of other times, I went down to Brazoria with my father's family on it because, excuse me, it was limited to a child who lived in the community. And I resented that. And so I found a way that almost everybody who was giving a program in Galveston, later on, I would find a way to do something. And in fact, when my good friend and fellow Texan, Kathy Gibson, who has traveled with me to Galveston several times, say that she met people who said, oh yes, anybody who would let Faye Helen on the program, she was ready to speak. And the people who knew me as a child knew, they never knew which church I belonged to. But Juneteenth was the biggest celebration throughout the whole Gulf Coast region. And everybody celebrated. And almost every other Black person that I knew was a historian of some kind. Everybody had a family story. Everybody had a story about where they were, or a story from their family about where they were when freedom came, meeting the colored troops. So the beginnings of Juneteenth was with General Order 3. Now there are 5 orders. I didn't learn about the other 4 until I was almost ready to go to college. And it is very significant that you understand that there were 5, because the first order declares all acts of the Confederacy null and void. That is extremely important because it ended the life of the Confederacy and their reign in Texas. And Texas was the last state of the Confederacy to fall to the Union. Ironically, South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union, and Tennessee was the first state to be readmitted. But those 11 states, of course, that joined the Confederacy paid no attention at all to the Emancipation Proclamation. So Juneteenth set a new pace and a new direction for the whole country, because it meant that the Confederacy no longer existed. It meant then, it made a way for the 13th Amendment, which was passed December of 1865, which finally declared that there was to be no more slavery in the whole country. So I hope that as we celebrate Juneteenth becoming a national holiday, that we recognize what it meant for the whole country, not just Galveston. Thank you. Okay. Okay. I want to add one more thing, is that Sam Collins's grandmother and I grew up together, and we spent our summers in Brazoria, Texas, and you saw on the map where it's inland. Our families owned adjoining farms, and our summers, the kids from Galveston came down to the country relatives, we called them. But Sam is the 7th generation of his family that I've known.
I mean, how do you follow Attorney Williams? Right? You know, there's a Buddhist saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. So I want to thank her for joining us on the panel, because I've learned so much from her throughout the years. I was a little nervous that I didn't talk enough about those other 4 general orders in the documentary, and she was going to chastise me a little bit, but it's in love.
Yes.
But Juneteenth is not just an African-American holiday. It is something that we all should embrace and celebrate if we value freedom and liberty. So July 4th represents a birthday for the country, and Juneteenth represents a freedom birthday for African Americans. That second sentence is important to me. This involves an absolute equality. When we look at the definitions of those 2 words, absolute and equality, we still don't have that today. So we still have a lot of work, and hopefully with the Juneteenth holiday becoming a national holiday. Now, it became popular, as I stated, in 2020, but it has always been important to the descendants of the enslaved and those former enslaved people. Just as Attorney Williams has just stated, at 4 years old, it was such an impressionable event on her life that it still has ripple effects to those that heard that story in this audience today.
Wonderful. I think as I'm listening And I'm so honored to be sitting here with you. I've been thinking about some of the writings of Toni Morrison and and her definitions of what it means to be free. I mean, it's really a difficult concept to even imagine what it means to be in bondage, to be owned by another individual. And that transition from slavery to freedom was much more profound than what we see on paper. And that is what we're celebrating, in a sense, is that transition. When we've talked about Galveston, and we've talked about Texas, and I do have, as Marsh indicated, roots in both Texas and Oklahoma. I've got my siblings live out in Texas, in Bryan and Irving, and I thought I would share some images today with you that might generate some conversation about how that emancipation impacted just an ordinary family living out there in Texas and Oklahoma. My family was there at the time of emancipation, in the 1860s. So it's a kind of an unusual story, and I'll try to fly through it because I don't want this thing to become about me, but hopefully it'll spark some interesting conversation. We came out to that region of the country on the Trail of Tears. You know, you always see these images of the Trail of Tears, and you see all these indigenous people being forced to move from North Carolina, from Georgia, Tennessee, and Mississippi and Alabama out to what eventually became Oklahoma. But they were called the 5 civilized tribes, and the reason they were called civilized is because they tried to assimilate and buy into all of this stuff that this thing we call America is, including the institution of slavery. So some would argue, some scholars, that the vast majority of the people that walked on the Trail of Tears were Black, carrying their stuff. And that's the way my family got out there. And this is my family. We'll just fly through this. Lots of Black folks out in Oklahoma. We'll go ahead with advance. And that's me there with my grandfather, who was born in Welliston, Arcadia, Oklahoma in 1903. That's still long before statehood, and he's holding me there. Yes. And that was that's my parents getting married, and my grandfather and my grandmother, and then on the far left is Bootsy, my great grandmother, who was born in Texas in the all these folks came up. A lot of them came from the South, but a lot of them, if you consider Texas the South in that regard, a lot of them came up across the Red River and formed these towns and these settlements. And then a lot of these towns and settlements were established by freedmen of these indigenous people: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminoles. Keep on going. So these towns still exist today. There were over 100 at one point in Oklahoma. And we can still see these traditions today in rodeos all over the state, bowling. Some of them are huge. You'd just be amazed, because this is where the word cowboy came from. That's the Bowley Rodeo, and we like to do these parades and these celebrations. And that's the first time I heard Juneteenth, going to the Bowley Rodeo in Oklahoma. This is the Okmulgee Rodeo with 6,000 contestants, Black. And little children are still learning these traditions and doing this same work today. So these traditions, just like we see in Galveston, are continuing in beautiful ways. And there's battles because the Cherokees, for example, like to have the privilege of being a sovereign nation, but not the responsibility. And so we've been battling as Cherokee freedmen. So I'm just going to kind of run through these. Again, that was my grandfather, Al Denny, who was born in 1903 in Arcadia, Oklahoma. And Okay, we'll just keep going. And then I've been looking at census reviews, and you can see a lot of my family members were born in Oklahoma, but they came up from Texas as freed individual. And that is Bootsy on the left. And then that's a picture of her when she was a young lady on the right. Yes, we just keep flying through these. And that was the man she eventually married, Al Denny. And on his left, if I can go back to that one, I'm sorry. That's Al Denny, my grandfather on top. And then the boy is George Denny on the left there. And he actually burned up in the Tulsa race massacre, which happened a few years after this image. And he survived. 90% of his body was burned. Okay. So you can see Oklahoma and Texas. Ida, that's Bootsy, born in Texas. Okay. Yeah. And that was George on the floor there. Yeah. That's the young man and my great-great-grandfather sitting there on the floor. Okay. We'll just keep going. There's the young Bootsy again. And I'm really blessed to have these images. That's Bootsy's mother, Eliza, who was born in Oklahoma and brought to Texas. We were owned by, the Cherokee sold us to a Jewish, German Jew named Augustus Teichmann, and he fathered her. And so that was Eliza. And then if we go one more, oh, there's Eliza when she was young. They came back to Oklahoma on the land run in 1889. She and her brother, that was Wyndham, who came from Mississippi to Texas. Again, these are wealthy slave owners. Joe Freon, okay, keep going, yeah. I'm trying to kind of fly through these, but you can see the Texas connection. And then finally, the young girl that came across the Trail of Tears at age 6, her name was Elizabeth. I asked my father once, my grandfather, what was her last name? And he said, it was whatever. You know, her last name was irrelevant, but her name was Elizabeth, and she was Eliza's mother. And she came out to Nacogdoches, Texas, across the Red River into Texas in the 1860s, because the Cherokees were fighting each other in the Civil War. Some of them fought for the Confederacy, some of them fought for the Union. And these are some of her children there. We call this picture deer hunters. And these cats were living in Wheelock, Texas, and they weren't playing around. You know, so Augustus, if we shoot a little further, close up, second from the left on the front row, said that he was born in Old Mexico. And what I learned in Texas history is the reason that people would put that on the census is because if you were born before 1845, you had voting rights after slavery. If you were born as a slave or come out after 1865, yes, we had this equality, but what did that mean? We couldn't vote. So that's why people would put that on there. So that's Augustus Mantooth there. And John Starks. Y'all remember Starks, that's all Eliza Starks. So I just wanted to share that story as part of a typical Texas, Oklahoma family living in that state during the 19th century.
Could I add one more thing? Many people don't know that the 5 civilized nations signed a treaty to free their enslaved people on June 14th, 1866.
That's right.
So even after Juneteenth, there were still enslaved people in territories. So yes, the freedom story is more than just one day. And people say, well, it's not just about Galveston and it's just not about that one day. The freedom fight continues. But when we think about why set aside one day on the calendar, if you think about Memorial Day, we just had passed, it is a time that the country chose to honor those that gave an ultimate sacrifice at war. Now, those families may have got a message in January, they may have got a message in February, March, April, all throughout the year of their family member dying at war. But Memorial Day is the one day that we pause to remember that. So now that we have Juneteenth as a day on the calendar, it does not mean that it's only about Galveston. Every community can find, like Florida has a May 20th day. I think in Washington, D.C., it's April 15th or 16th. Freedom came to these different territories at different times. So it's not so much a competition of which community should lead the conversation. We all should take part in the conversation and discuss all of this history on every platform that we get, and to tell the story, as he talked about one of his ancestors being fathered by the enslaver. The DNA of the enslaver and the enslaved runs through my veins. I cannot separate that. Nobody's 100% anything except human. We're all 100% human. So when you do your DNA test, I might be your cousin.
I think about the famous words of our late Desmond Tutu, and who said that, and this was at the World Cup or something in South Africa, and he said that Africa is the cradle of human existence, and he said, so all you folks coming here from France, from England, from Russia, from China, from the United States, welcome home. So yeah.
Ms. Williams did bring on display, we have this freedom tree, which was done by Earl Jones, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more about it. But Earl is also born on the island. And I don't want there to be a divide because we're born on the island. You don't feel like you're BOI. So I'm gonna help you relax. You are BOI. You are born off island. All right. So if you want to explain a little bit of.
Well, the Freedom Tree became very important to me several years ago because as a child, when I went to Brazoria to celebrate Freedom Day, the adults would separate the children from, the children would be picnicking, and suddenly there'd be this, adults would disappear, and they said they're going down to the freedman's tree, it was called then. Well, I, of course, was a very curious child, and I always resented the fact that I could not go. Well, finally, as an adult and returning, I was able to find out more about the freedman's tree. There was a farm in Sweeney, Texas, which is part of Brazoria County, where my father's family was born and owned land. The plantation had been bought by an oil company, and the folklore about the tree had circulated, and they commissioned an artist. The tree was rotting. It was over, of course, 100 years old then. And they commissioned a young man who, as Sam said, was a BOI, Earl Jones. His mother's family had been enslaved on that plantation. And he became a tree artist. And he was allowed to carve images in the tree, and the things that were left over, he made he was an entrepreneurial type. And this says Earl Jones 2013. The bottom of this is the actual from the remains of the tree. And the Brazoria County Museum now has a big carving from the freedman's tree, and the story in the newspaper, which is called Branches of History, tree around which Sweeney slaves learned of their freedom preserved as sculpture honoring African Americans. So this has become an important part of my memorabilia because I finally got a chance to have a piece of the freedman's tree.
So Earl took the tree and turned it upside down so the roots were spreading out, and there's 3 pieces to it. And now that Juneteenth has become a national holiday, the museum there in Brazoria is looking to put it on display in different areas. So if y'all ever want to try to get it up here, it's possible to do that. But he also works with metal and he paints. He's just an amazing artist. And for him to be able to work on that tree at a site where his ancestors were there at the time of the announcement again. You've heard a story at 4 years old. You heard his family's history story. And my family has those oral histories also. These stories are important. And I would encourage all young people to sit and listen to your elders. It's a library of information and knowledge. And when elders transition, it's like a library closing or burning. And it's so important to document those stories, those pictures, scan them, use your cell phone technology. You know, when I did this documentary, I went to school for accounting, not film. So it's important to also work as a team. So there was a young college student that had graduated in December of 2020, and I was introduced to him. He was looking for some work. I told him I got $2. You got to do it for $1. And he was excited about the opportunity, but we got it done. He rented equipment for 3 days. Every interview was done in basically one shot. It's like raw. We did not go back and, you know, he allowed him to restate some things sometimes, but for the most part, we had to get it all done in 3 days. Now his editing took longer than 3 days, but he actually came down. I rented a bed and breakfast and say, these are the people you need to talk to. You got like 3 hours. That's it. We're not overrunning the budget because it's just on my budget. I got 2 kids in college. It's not happening. So we did not front load it. It was important to me to have equity in a project because I built in a benefit to a local nonprofit, the Neocultural Center, so that we would have residual benefits to support programming going forward. So we are not always dependent on the charity of others, which is dependent on if they like us or not. If they like us, we'll get funding. When they get upset with us, they will cut funding. But if we create projects in which we have equity and ownership, then we can control the flow of the resources. So as an example, this year at Moody Gardens, they're going to show the documentary and they were going to charge $6 a ticket and pay us $1.80. Or we could show the film for free to the community, but you have to pay $4 to get your ticket printed, with $3 going to the nonprofit. Well, I opted to take the $3 to the nonprofit because I don't need to create more income in the sense that I don't want to have to pay more taxes, and that $1.80 wasn't that important. The $3 to the nonprofit is more important because they can benefit long-term. I don't know how many people are going to show up, 500, 200, thousands, I don't know. But the point was I had control of the revenue stream and to make the decision that I wanted that money to flow to the nonprofit. Sometimes people think, well, Sam's just in it to make money for itself. What I'm trying to create is a formula that will create residual benefits into perpetuity for our community so that we're not dependent on charity of others that may or may not agree with us.
That's good. Tell them what the Neocultural Center is.
Oh, the Neocultural Center is a nonprofit organization led by Sue Johnson, who is the executive director. They've been in the community of Galveston working for 30 years, since 1992. Sue does an amazing job with programs there in the community. They have right now they're getting ready for the Freedom School this summer, 6-week reading program to help students not fall back. I used to take my children to programs, Kwanzaa programs, there are cultural programs to help individuals learn about the history of not only African Americans, but Africans prior to coming to the United States. And Sue's organization is finally reaping the benefits. When we did the mural project, they were our fiscal sponsor. So instead of trying to create a separate nonprofit, there was a young lady, Tarina Harris, who suggested that we partner with the Neocultural Center, and totally agree with that. I also want to mention that the project, the Absolute Equality Project, and even the film project that I was doing would not be possible without the contributions of Ms. Sheridan Lorenz, who was an early seeder to our project, a Mitchell descendant in the Mitchell family. They own the building where the mural is at. They own the corner. So it is important to have strategic partnerships with those that control resources and assets that allowed for us to place this amazing mural in a public space. As we reimagine monuments and memorials in public spaces, it is difficult to do the work without allies. Now there's allyship fatigue because people get tired. Do we have to keep talking about this? Yes, we have to. And if we don't talk about it today, we're going to talk about it tomorrow. But the point is, you do need strategic partnerships with people that control resources and assets that can help, while at the same time you're trying to create your own assets. So that's important. And there were other partners and supporters, but I specifically want to acknowledge the work of Ms. Sheridan Lorenz, because if she had not been willing to seed the project in Galveston, I wouldn't be on the stage right now talking about this, and it wouldn't have given birth to the documentary idea in 2014. There was another group that wanted to do a documentary, but I'm always sitting at the table talking about equity. And if you don't want to give up equity and ownership to benefit our local community, then I don't want to talk about it. And we can be fair if we share. It's better. I think there's there's a story about someone speaking to some African children, and he put a prize, 100 yards away from them, or 100 feet. And he said, whoever runs down there to it, can get it, can win the prize. And he said, okay, go. All the children held hand and they all walked. Why should we run? If we all walk, we could get down there and share it together. That's a powerful story. I don't know if I told it exactly right, but we could hold hands and do this thing together.
You certainly got the point across. And I like what you're saying about doing this kind of work. And it's not only about people who may not agree or position themselves in ways that don't support or that can withdraw support, but it's also, when we get support, sometimes strings comes with it. And we have to make sure that that's eliminated too, so that the mission can still be what it is and what it means, versus something else or something watered down or something distorted in a way that undermines the reality of what we're dealing with here.
And the example of individuals like Ms. Williams and her strength, as she walked in, I was in Marsha's office and I told him I was looking out, taking pictures of her. And while the steps were not fast, they were purposeful and strong. Right? And you could just see the authority in which she walks and speaks. So that's why it's important to listen. So I'm gonna listen to what else she has to say.
Everybody in that film I know and have worked with. Many of you who know me know for the last 20 years, except for I've spent my winters in Galveston. Well, being involved with those people that you saw in that film is part of what keeps me going back and understanding that I don't live there all year, but I have important relationships and allies who, if I say we're going to do something. We've honored the longshoremen, and most of us who grew up on the island had a relationship with the shipping industry in some way. And it's very important that we honor those people, because the longshoremen were the first in 1942 to have Juneteenth written into their contract as a holiday.
Marsh has a mic. If there's going to be questions from the audience, we would. Yeah. And while I'm up here, I'm going to drive over to Wilberforce tomorrow. So it's a pilgrimage for me. As they spoke about that, I said, if I ever got close enough, I had been up here before, but I want to drive over to be on the grounds because it inspires me to continue the work, because it's not easy work. It's not difficult. You're not always popular. There are challenges of telling the truth. It's not about theory. It's about truth. And James Baldwin has a quote, these innocent people are trapped in a history they don't understand. Until they understand it, they can't be released from it or healed from it. And we have to tell the truth so that we could become better. And the last thing, since we're with a preservation group, you'll appreciate this. We're all on the deed of America's house. Everybody. This is our American home. But this home needs work in the foundation. It needs to be rewired. It needs new plumbing so that future generations can live in this house. So I have to crawl under the house, past the ants and dead bodies, to do the work so that my children, grandchildren, and children not yet born can survive or live in this house. So just like you walk into that structure, you see pictures on the wall. When you don't see a picture of yourself or representation, we need to get some more pictures up on the wall. So that's why I do the work that I do to repair this house so that we all can live in it together. And of course, there are family members that don't want to do their share of chores, but we're going to make them do their work.
Got one in the back there, a couple in the back. While Marsh is heading back there, my students were working on this memorial for George Floyd, doing some memorials for several victims around the country, and people assumed that would be in Minneapolis, but with the research, he ended up doing the memorial at Emancipation Park. That was a proposal. And I'm curious about, I know Phil Freeland, the late Freeland, did some design works for that park, and it's a major piece. And I'm curious about the relationship between Galveston and Houston in that regard with Emancipation Park.
Yeah, we just did a project with them. I showed the documentary last Wednesday, or this past Wednesday. And they're celebrating 150 years. They were established in 1872. So it's the oldest public park with continuous Juneteenth commemorations there. I know we have some people with questions. I could speak more to that.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much. Miles Foster, and I'm here with my husband from Gary, Indiana. And he was adamant about us coming today. And your grounds are spectacular. Your facility is so beautiful. But I want you to know that I received what you said, and I'll take it back home and I'll do what I'm supposed to do. And Dr. Maya Angelou said, people may forget what you said, they may forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So I'm so glad and grateful for coming today and listening to your stories, because it is about our stories. And I believe that with the help and support of each and every one who, as you said, make the human society, we then can be a better people. So thank you so much.
I think that was a question right there. Behind you, Marsh.
I'm very happy to be here. Sister Faye, good to see you. I have a question. I'd like to debunk a myth with your expertise on the panel. Having researched and participated in Juneteenth around Austin, Texas, and Dallas over the last 30 years. There is an understanding that Juneteenth as one day, but then it's also, I've found and have been told by my elders, the 10th of June through to the 19th justifies Juneteenth. And around Dallas during Juneteenth, they celebrated with different activities throughout the city from the 10th through the 19th. And though we are now embracing Juneteenth here in Indiana, and for some reason we've been stuck on one day, and now that more organizations are lifting up the banner for our emancipation celebration, there's so many things to do on one day. And I'm hoping that once we can figure out if this is truth, that we can celebrate from the 10th through the 19th, then we don't have to be stuck trying to figure out 4 or 5 Juneteenths to attend on one day, and let us come together as organizers and figure out, let's do Juneteenth over there on this day, let's have a celebration over here on this day, so that we are passing and celebrating and educating over a time period, instead of people frustrated about where to go all on the same day because everybody didn't communicate well enough to make sure that we gave opportunities for more people to participate over a longer term. Could you please share what Galveston and the mainland down in that area does in regards to the 10th through the 19th, please?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry if that was long-winded.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of parts I'd like to speak to in that statement or question. In Galveston, there's 2 to 3 weeks of events and activities. And often that was because that was not a set day. So they would often do events the Saturday before the 19th. So if the 19th went into in the week, Monday through Friday, the weekend before, they would have activities, and that would be a lot. So Galveston has been having multi-week event for years out of necessity. And I think it's important that we talk about this history 365 days a year. So we don't just have to be stuck in June or February talking about African-American history. I equate it to a history to like a salad. The lettuce and tomatoes are the stories you hear all the time of the founding fathers and early settlers. This doesn't make them more important, but this is just the analogy of the salad. But this salad includes croutons, bacon bits, olives, pickles, sliced onions. And sometimes when you slice into that onion, it'll make you cry. Sometimes when you bite that crouton, it will be hard and hard to swallow. But the point is, we need to flavor up these discussions from January through December, and specifically around Juneteenth. There were a lot of events. Galveston had actually surrendered, I believe, June 4th or 5th. That had already happened. Granger just happened to get there the 18th and 19th. So a delegation of leaders from Galveston went to New Orleans. They negotiated the surrender on June 2nd, and then they came back to Galveston. They raised the American flag at the Custom House early in June. Some of the United States colored troops had arrived before, not only to Galveston before Granger, but down in South Texas, because they had to secure the southern border. And there were thousands of these soldiers that had came over to other areas and other ports. And then they had came up to Galveston to get supplies. And there's an attempt to say, well, you know, Galveston was kind of an accident. But General Sheridan had ordered Granger to go to Galveston and issue these orders. So Granger was going there purposefully, but there were many other ships that came there to get supplies because they could get into Galveston. So hopefully that we got another question up front.
You want to pull that up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Ruth Holliday, and I have a question for both Sam and Faye.
in the excellent documentary, I believe it was you, Sam, who said, quoting Miss Williams, it was not a piece of, you were talking about your grandfather, it was not a piece of paper that freed the slaves, but the men with the guns. And that just struck me as being very emblematic of our country. And I just would like to hear each of you amplify a little bit about that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, this year, the theme of the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation is Juneteenth Fathers of Freedom. It falls on Father's Day, but these men were freedom fighters. And I'm gonna let her speak more about her grandfather because I didn't meet him. She's met all my people. I didn't meet all her people.
Yeah,
so she could tell you firsthand.
I am his grandmother's peer. Not his. My grandfather was a very irreverent man and tended to resent a couple of the stories about emancipation, especially the one that said they got the word late. And that's why he was aware that, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation had no official meaning in the Confederacy. Therefore, when he says the men with the guns arrived, what he means when the Union Army occupied Texas. And therefore, that it was that occupation by the Union Army and the issuance of General Order 3 of June 19th, 65, that made the Emancipation Proclamation enforceable. And that's why if you have a copy of General Order 3 that says the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation issued by the President of the United States, all slaves are free. It was then in December of 1865 that finally the 13th Amendment was adopted, which made slavery illegal in all of the states. Because the other thing that's important to note is there were 4 slave states that did not join the Confederacy. So if the Emancipation Proclamation states that all slaves in states that are in rebellion, that meant Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, which were legally slave states, were not even intended to be freed. So some historians have interpreted that it was an act to punish the Confederacy. It was not necessarily a way to free slavery, but it changed the direction of the war and therefore set in motion. There's something that I have someplace in my records that is the state of Illinois, which was Lincoln State, that legislature adopted a resolution stating that the Emancipation Proclamation was illegal and unwarranted. So even Illinois, from which Lincoln had been elected as a resident when he went to Washington, objected to the Emancipation Proclamation. I have, I think, do they have the? It's up
for you.
There's I put there's a statement about reconstruction state by state. And if you look at it, you will see when each state, each of the Confederate states declared succession, when they joined the Confederacy, and then when they were readmitted. So you see, it wasn't just a one act issuing an order. It was a process by which each of the Confederate states had to be captured, occupied, and then readmitted. So there's a lot to celebrate And I know there are a lot of people in Indiana who grew up in Tennessee and Alabama, Florida, Mississippi. There might be a reason to start a celebration of when those states were readmitted and when they left. That part of the history. I've been proposing for some time to people is that we create something called the Emancipation Scholars. And we look up the history of when each of the states that left the Union came back in and under what terms. It was called Reconstruction.
And to a point, just to speak about those soldiers, by January of 1866, General Philip Sheridan was speaking about his soldiers in Texas. He said he had 6,500 white soldiers in Texas, 19,768 black soldiers. Nowhere in elementary, junior high, high school, or college did anyone share these facts that there were black soldiers occupying cities and helping to spread freedom throughout not only Texas, but other states. So when you think about Appomattox and in the end of the Civil War, black soldiers were there to force Lee to surrender. There's one book in which a Union soldier is writing to his mother and sister, and he states that they were so close, but then they started falling back. They were starting to lose until over the hill came this dark column. He said, "What cared we, the race of men? They brought us relief." They didn't care if they was black or white, they needed some help. And Lee surrendered after that, and then many white soldiers were mustered out because they had been fighting longer. Therefore, that gave the black soldiers an opportunity to go into Texas and continue this work of spreading the message of freedom. So they were ordered over because many of the others were ready to kind of go home too. And I tell individuals, if my wife and children are on the other side of that door and somebody has to go rescue them, I'm not looking for nobody on the stage. I'm not looking to my left or right. It's my job to go get them. So those soldiers, as she stated, the men with the guns, said, "We have family over there. We have cousins over there. I have a brother over there. My mother may be over there." Because many enslavers moved west thinking Texas would never surrender. So they tried to take their property further west and hide out in Texas. And somebody probably said, "You know, I have a brother over there. I'll go. We need volunteers to go to Texas. Plus, I got a uniform, I'm gonna get fed, and I got a gun that I could use." Not that I'm advocating violence, but at the time of war, in order to free their family, they were willing to do that. And, you know, I don't expect anybody else to protect my family. It's my job. And now our weapons of mass destruction are books, knowledge, and information. We use it to destroy darkness, ignorance, and intolerance by shedding light with truth from primary source documents. So we don't fight with bullets and guns, we fight with books and knowledge.
That's really important to think about in the larger context too, you know, as we talked about with Illinois and Indiana with our ugly history and living in anti-Black space and what it meant to have a state constitution that prohibited Black people from even settling here in 1851. So where was the Mason-Dixon line? Was it the Canadian border? We really don't know. But what did emancipation mean? For my family that I showed you, it meant transitioning from being a slave to being a servant.
And Marsh, I want to give you one little trivia fact so that if you're on Jeopardy, you might need the answer to this question. When Lincoln was a young attorney in Illinois, the first enslaved woman he helped to free was a woman named Nancy Leggins Costley. in 1841. In 1841, there's a book by a gentleman named Carl Adams. They were from Peoria, I believe. You can look up Nance, N-A-N-C-E, like Nancy or Nance. Leggins Costley, L-E-G-I-N-S, and they have Costley spelled several different ways. But she had an infant child named William Costley. William Costley grew up in 1864, and he joined the Union Army. And I'm gonna give you one guess of what city he was in on June 19th, 1865. Who's gonna be my valedictorian? Galveston. So the thing is, this first woman helped to get her freedom by Lincoln, and the first male child eventually grew up, became part of the army, and brought that message of freedom. So regionally, that is very important that those freedom fighters came down and helped to deliver that message. And for me, it's a pilgrimage to be here in the area and territory. And again, I want to thank the Indiana Landmarks for inviting me up. I'm going to give Morris this lapel from Galveston. So from me to you. I just received this. It's the only one I have too. So
You know what?
I just get.
Sam,
Yes,
tell
ma'am.
them about Marshall's Galveston connection.
Oh, yeah. So Marsh was the executive director at GHF. I want to make sure I don't stick you there. And I'm going through the whole. He was the executive director, and he was the one that helped to get me on the National Trust for Historic Preservation Board of Advisors. So if not for the seed he planted back then, you would not be enjoying the shade from this tree today.
Well, if I did that, it's the best thing I've ever done. So thank you. Well, we could go on for a long time. It's a great discussion. And I thank you all for staying with us throughout and coming in on this beautiful day. Just a few last words. We do have in our building, the Rapp Family Gallery, which is at the lower level. I encourage you to come down and take a look. The show we have up is called Transparency. It features the work of two local artists, glass artists, Judy Sloan and Clayton Hamilton, who's known locally as the Wall Guy, who for 30 years has painted socio-political commentary on the retaining wall at 38th and College. And he has transferred some of those messages from the wall to panels, and they're on display down in the gallery. So as you exit the building, there'll be some people to help you find your way down and find your way back. According to Clayton Hamilton, his work, quote, calls attention to the numerous inconsistencies that were born and are still being fought against due to the enslavement and its heritage of systemic injustice. So please come down and take a look at that. And lastly, if you are not a member of Indiana Landmarks, we would love to have you join our organization. My associates will be out at a table in the lobby to take care of that. But again, Sam, Faye, Olin, thank you so much. A beautiful program.
Where's your photographer?
He may have gone.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to get somebody to take our photo.